The moonlight between us. Chapter 1, The Stranger's Eyes. Seraphina's bare feet hit the cold forest floor as she ran through the rain-soaked pines, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The storm had knocked out power to her remote cabin 3 hours ago, and now something was prowling in the darkness beyond her windows, something that moved too smoothly, too deliberately to be just another wild animal. She clutched the baseball bat in her trembling hands, knowing it would be useless if her worst fears came true. After 5 years of hiding in these mountains, after 5 years of believing she was finally safe, had Cale somehow found her again? A sharp crack echoed through the trees behind her, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crushing the wet undergrowth. Seraphina's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she stumbled over a fallen log, her white nightgown catching on thorns that tore at the fabric like desperate fingers. The rain plastered her long auburn hair to her face, making it impossible to see clearly in the pitch-black forest. She could hear her pursuer getting closer, moving with an inhuman grace that made her stomach twist with terror. This was exactly how her nightmares always began, running through endless darkness while something ancient and hungry stalked her through the shadows. When she finally burst through the tree line into the small clearing where her cabin sat like a lonely lighthouse in an ocean of wilderness, Seraphina's legs nearly gave out beneath her. But what she saw on her front porch made her heart stop completely. A man stood there in the pouring rain, his massive frame silhouetted against her door, and for one terrifying moment she thought Cale had finally come to drag her back to hell. But as lightning split the sky overhead, illuminating his face in stark detail, she realized this stranger was nothing like her brutal ex-mate. This man was beautiful in a way that seemed almost supernatural, high cheekbones, sharp jawline, and skin that seemed to glow even in the storm's darkness. "Please," the stranger called out, his deep voice cutting through the thunder like silk through steel. "I don't mean any harm. I just need shelter until the storm passes." He raised his hands slowly, showing her he was unarmed, but something about the gesture seemed almost mocking, as if weapons were unnecessary for someone like him. His eyes caught the next flash of lightning, and for a split second they seemed to burn with an inner fire that made Seraphina's breath catch in her throat. She had seen eyes like that before, but never golden like molten amber, never so hypnotically beautiful that she wanted to step closer instead of running away. Seraphina stood frozen in the rain, her baseball bat still raised between them like a pathetic shield against forces she couldn't begin to understand. Every instinct screamed at her to run deeper into the forest, to never trust another dangerous man who appeared in her sanctuary like a dark angel seeking sanctuary. But something in his posture, the way he kept his distance, the careful way he spoke, the genuine exhaustion she could see in those impossible eyes, made her lower the bat just an inch. She had been alone for so long, so desperately alone, and the storm was getting worse by the minute. What harm could one night possibly do? Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Not when she sold her car for cash in a truck stop bathroom, not when she used a fake name to rent this cabin in the middle of nowhere, not even when the loneliness threatened to swallow her whole during those first terrible winter months when she wondered if she had simply traded one kind of death for another. The cabin had been her salvation and her prison for 5 long years, a tiny sanctuary hidden so deep in the Cascade Mountains that even the mail delivery required a 40-minute hike through unmarked trails. She had learned to live without electricity most days, chopping her own firewood and growing vegetables in the small cleared patch behind the house. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and the closest town was a 3-hour drive on roads that became impassable in winter. It was the perfect place to disappear, the perfect place to heal, and the perfect place to slowly go insane from the crushing weight of absolute solitude that pressed down on her like a living thing with teeth and claws. But even in her isolation, even with all the precautions and the fake identity and the carefully constructed new life, Seraphina never stopped looking over her shoulder. Cale Morrison was not the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that he was still searching for her with the patience of a predator and the resources of someone who had never been told no in his entire privileged life. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night convinced she had heard his voice calling her name through the trees, and she would lie there in the darkness with her heart racing until dawn finally brought the illusion of safety. The stranger on her porch might be dangerous, but at least he was a devil she didn't know, and after 5 years of running from the devil she did know, that felt almost like hope. Seraphina's hands trembled as she unlocked the front door, her keys jingling like wind chimes in the storm's fury, but she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision to let this mysterious stranger inside her sanctuary. He stepped across the threshold with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to moving through dangerous territory, and she caught a scent that made her pulse quicken, something wild and clean like pine forests and mountain air, but underneath it all was something darker, something that spoke to parts of her she had forgotten existed. His presence filled the small cabin's main room like smoke, making the space feel both smaller and somehow more alive than it had in years, as if the very air had awakened from a long sleep just to accommodate him. "Thank you," he said simply, but his voice carried depths that made her want to step closer and farther away at the same time. Water dripped from his dark hair onto her wooden floors, creating small puddles that caught the flickering light from her emergency candles, and she found herself mesmerized by the way the shadows played across his sharp features. He was tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the low beams of her ceiling, broad enough that his shoulders seemed to span the entire width of her doorway, and there was something about the careful way he moved that reminded her of a wolf testing unfamiliar ground. "I'm Dante," he added, and even his name sounded like something whispered in ancient languages under blood-red moons. "Seraphina," she replied automatically, then immediately regretted giving him her real name after 5 years of using aliases with everyone she met. But there was something about this man that seemed to pull truth from her like water from a well, something that made deception feel not just difficult but somehow wrong. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware that her rain-soaked nightgown was practically transparent, and caught him deliberately looking away to give her privacy. That small gesture of respect did something strange to her chest, loosening a knot of fear she hadn't even realized was still there after all these years of expecting every man to be a predator in disguise. "I should get you some dry clothes," she said, her voice coming out softer than she intended, and she hurried to her bedroom to find something that might fit his impressive frame. As she rummaged through the few oversized sweaters she owned, Seraphina caught herself wondering what his story was, why someone who looked like he belonged in magazine spreads or corporate boardrooms was wandering alone through mountain storms. There was something almost otherworldly about his beauty, something that made her think of fallen angels and ancient myths about creatures that were too dangerous for mortal hearts to handle. But when she returned with a thick wool sweater and dry jeans, she found him standing perfectly still by her fireplace, staring into the cold ashes as if he could see visions in the darkness that she couldn't even imagine. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross, filled with the sound of rain against windows and the distant rumble of thunder that seemed to be moving farther away with each passing moment. Seraphina set the clothes on her small dining table and busied herself lighting the fire, grateful for something to do with her hands while she processed the reality that she was no longer alone in her carefully constructed fortress of solitude. But as the flames began to catch and dance, casting warm light across the cabin's interior, she could feel his eyes on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. When she finally turned to face him, she found those golden eyes studying her with something that looked almost like recognition, as if he had been searching for her specifically rather than simply seeking shelter from the storm. Chapter 2: The Heat Between Strangers. The fire crackled to life with a warmth that seemed to breathe new energy into the small cabin, and Seraphina found herself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every breath in the suddenly charged atmosphere. Dante had changed into the dry clothes she provided, and somehow he managed to make her oversized sweater look like it had been tailored specifically for his broad shoulders and lean waist. She caught herself staring at the way the firelight played across his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the impossible perfection of his mouth, and she had to force herself to look away before he noticed her fascination. It had been so long since she had been alone with a man who didn't make her want to run screaming into the night, so long since she had felt anything other than fear and suspicion in the presence of masculine power. You live here alone, Dante said, and it wasn't quite a question but wasn't quite a statement either. His voice held a note of something that might have been concern, or perhaps curiosity about what could drive someone to choose such complete isolation. Seraphina nodded, suddenly self-conscious about her simple life, her rough hands from years of manual labor, her complete lack of makeup or styled hair. But when she looked up at him, she found no judgment in those golden eyes, only a kind of understanding that made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. It's peaceful, she replied, though they both knew that peace and loneliness were often just different words for the same kind of silence. They sat on opposite ends of her small sofa, the space between them crackling with an energy that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the way he seemed to see straight through all her carefully constructed defenses. Dante asked gentle questions about her garden, her books, the photographs on her mantelpiece, and she found herself talking more than she had in months, maybe years. There was something about his presence that made her feel safe enough to remember who she had been before Kale had systematically destroyed her confidence, her voice, her ability to trust her own instincts. But underneath the comfortable conversation, she could sense something wild and dangerous about this stranger, something that made her pulse quicken and her skin flush with a heat that had nothing to do with the fireplace. As the night deepened around them, the storm gradually fading to a gentle rain against the windows, Seraphina found herself studying the way Dante's hands moved when he spoke, graceful and strong, with long fingers that looked like they could be incredibly gentle or devastatingly powerful depending on the situation. There were thin scars across his knuckles that spoke of violence in his past, but when he reached for his coffee mug, his movements were so carefully controlled that she wondered if he was always conscious of his own strength. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes would flash with something that seemed almost inhuman, something wild and predatory that sent shivers down her spine for reasons she couldn't quite name. I should probably sleep on the floor, Dante said as the fire began to burn low, his voice carefully neutral but his eyes holding depths of meaning that made her breath catch. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. The consideration in his words, the way he automatically assumed she might need space and safety, did something profound to her heart that years of therapy and self-help books had never managed to achieve. But as Seraphina looked at this beautiful, dangerous stranger who had appeared in her life like a gift wrapped in storm clouds, she realized that comfort was the last thing she wanted. For the first time in 5 years, she wanted to feel alive again, wanted to remember what it was like to be desired by someone who saw her as more than just a victim to be controlled or a problem to be solved. Seraphina woke to the smell of coffee and bacon frying in her own kitchen, and for a moment she thought she was still dreaming. It had been so long since anyone else had moved through her space, creating the simple domestic sounds that turned a house into a home. Dante stood at her stove with his back to her, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows and catching in his dark hair, and she allowed herself a few precious seconds to just watch him before the reality of the situation crashed back over her. She had let a complete stranger spend the night in her sanctuary, had shared more of herself in one evening than she had with anyone in years, and now he was making breakfast in her kitchen like they were lovers instead of two lost souls who had found temporary shelter in each other's loneliness. "Good morning," he said without turning around, and she wondered how he had known she was awake when her bare feet had made no sound on the wooden floors. There was something almost supernatural about his awareness, the way he seemed to sense her presence without using any of his obvious senses, and it sent a little thrill of unease through her chest that she couldn't quite shake. When he finally faced her with a plate of perfectly prepared food and a smile that could have melted glaciers, Seraphina felt her carefully constructed walls crumble just a little bit more. "I hope you don't mind," he added, gesturing to the breakfast. "I wanted to do something to thank you for your kindness." They ate together at her small table as the morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and Seraphina found herself memorizing every detail of this moment, the way he held his coffee mug, the sound of his quiet laughter when she told him stories about her vegetable garden's ongoing war with the local deer population, the way his eyes seemed to glow when the sunlight hit them at just the right angle. It felt surreal and perfect and terrifying all at once, like she was living inside someone else's life where beautiful men appeared during storms and made breakfast the morning after and looked at her like she was something precious instead of something broken. Part of her wanted to freeze this moment forever, to live in this golden bubble where she felt safe and desired and almost normal again. But as the morning progressed, Seraphina began to notice things about Dante that didn't quite add up to the story of a simple traveler caught in a storm. His clothes, while casual, were made from materials that probably cost more than she spent on groceries in 3 months, and there was a confidence in the way he moved through the world that spoke of someone accustomed to power and authority. When she asked him what brought him to these remote mountains, his answer was vague enough to be almost meaningless, something about needing time to think, to get away from complicated responsibilities in the city. But it was the way his jaw tightened when he said it, the way his golden eyes went distant and cold, that made her realize he was running from something just as surely as she was. As Dante prepared to leave, promising to repay her kindness someday in ways that made her pulse quicken with anticipation, Seraphina felt the familiar panic of abandonment clawing at her throat. 5 years of solitude had not prepared her for how desperately she would want to ask him to stay, how much she would crave the simple presence of someone who looked at her like she mattered. But as he paused in her doorway, silhouetted against the morning light like something from a dream she wasn't ready to wake up from, something moved in the tree line beyond her garden that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a familiar figure watching them from the shadows, a man with cold green eyes and a smile like broken glass who had haunted her nightmares for 5 long years. The figure disappeared into the forest before Seraphina could be sure of what she had seen, but the terror that flooded her system was real enough to make her legs weak and her hands shake like autumn leaves in a hurricane. For 5 years, she had lived with the constant fear that this moment would come, that Kale would somehow find her sanctuary and drag her back into the nightmare she had barely escaped with her life. But now, standing in her small cabin with morning sunlight streaming through windows that suddenly felt as fragile as paper, she realized that all her careful preparations and security measures had been nothing more than elaborate self-deception. There was nowhere in the world she could hide from a man who had the resources and determination to search every corner of the earth until he found what he considered his property. Dante noticed her distress immediately, his entire body going rigid with an alertness that reminded her of a predator sensing danger, and when he turned those golden eyes on her, she saw something burning in their depths that was definitely not human. The transformation in his demeanor was swift and complete. One moment he had been the gentle, considerate man who had made her breakfast and listened to her stories with genuine interest, and the next he was something wild and dangerous that made the air itself feel electric with barely contained power. "What is it?" he asked, his voice dropping to a register that seemed to vibrate through her bones and into her very soul, making her realize that whatever Dante really was, whatever secrets he was hiding beneath that perfect exterior, he was far more dangerous than any normal man had a right to be. "I thought I saw someone," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like war drums announcing an approaching army. "In the trees. Watching us." The words felt like shards of glass in her throat, each syllable carrying the weight of 5 years of nightmares and carefully suppressed terror that threatened to consume her from the inside out. She couldn't bring herself to say Kale's name out loud, couldn't give voice to the possibility that her worst nightmare had finally found her after 5 years of careful hiding and meticulous planning. Speaking his name would make it real, would acknowledge that the fragile peace she had built in these mountains was about to be shattered beyond repair. But something in Dante's expression told her he understood the gravity of the situation without needing all the details, and when he moved to the window to scan the forest with eyes that seemed to see far more than they should, every line of his body spoke of barely contained violence that made her pulse quicken with a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't quite name. There was a predatory grace in the way he moved, a fluid efficiency that spoke of someone accustomed to hunting and being hunted, someone who had spent his life navigating dangers that normal people couldn't even imagine. "You need to pack," he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for argument or negotiation. "Now. Whatever you're running from has found you, and staying here is no longer safe." The words hit her like physical blows, confirming what she had been desperately trying to deny since the moment she had glimpsed that familiar silhouette among the trees. Her sanctuary was compromised, her carefully constructed new life was crumbling around her, and once again she was going to have to run like a rabbit fleeing from wolves that had far too many teeth and far too much patience. The injustice of it all threatened to bring her to her knees. 5 years of isolation, 5 years of building something that resembled peace, 5 years of slowly learning to sleep through the night without jerking awake in terror, and it was all going to be destroyed in a matter of hours by a man who couldn't accept that she would rather live alone in the wilderness than spend another day as his victim. The next hour passed in a blur of frantic activity as Seraphina threw her most essential belongings into the same duffel bag she had used to escape 5 years ago, her hands shaking so badly she could barely zip it closed around the pathetic collection of items that represented her entire existence. Clothes that had seen better days, a few photographs of her grandmother that she couldn't bear to leave behind, the small amount of cash she kept hidden for emergencies, and her grandmother's silver locket, the only piece of jewelry she had managed to save from her previous life. Everything else, all the small comforts and improvements she had made to the cabin over the years, would have to be abandoned like everything else she had ever cared about. Dante moved through her cabin like a man accustomed to emergency evacuations, checking sight lines and exits with military precision while somehow managing to stay calm enough to keep her from completely falling apart under the weight of panic that threatened to consume her. His presence was both comforting and unsettling, comforting because she was no longer facing this nightmare alone, unsettling because she was beginning to realize that there were depths to this man that she had never suspected. The way he moved suggested someone familiar with violence and danger, someone who had spent considerable time in situations where survival depended on quick thinking and quicker reflexes. Who was Dante really, and what kind of life had he lived before that storm brought him to her door? As she stuffed her meager possessions into the bag with hands that refused to steady themselves, Seraphina found herself remembering fragments of her grandmother's stories, tales of creatures that walked between worlds, beings of such power and beauty that they could steal hearts and souls with nothing more than a glance. Grandmother Elena had always insisted that the stories weren't just entertainment, that their family had a connection to something ancient and powerful that most people had forgotten existed. But Seraphina had dismissed them as the ramblings of an old woman whose mind was beginning to slip, never imagining that there might be truth hidden in those whispered tales of wolves that wore human faces and magic that flowed through bloodlines like rivers through ancient valleys. But when a branch snapped loudly in the forest beyond her garden, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the property like a wolf stalking prey, they both froze in recognition that their time had run out. The methodical nature of the approaching footsteps spoke of someone who was taking his time, someone who knew his quarry was trapped and wanted to savor the anticipation of victory. Cale had always been like that. He enjoyed the psychological torture almost as much as the physical violence, drawing out her fear until she was nearly mad with terror before delivering the final blow that left her broken and begging for mercy that never came. Seraphina. Cale's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, sickeningly familiar and filled with the kind of possessive fury that had once made her curl up in closets and pray to become invisible. I know you're in there, sweetheart. Did you really think you could hide from me forever? Did you really think I wouldn't find you? His tone was conversational, almost casual, but she could hear the underlying rage that had been building for 5 years of searching, 5 years of being denied what he considered his rightful property. The pet name made her skin crawl with remembered revulsion, bringing back memories of whispered endearments that had always preceded his worst violence. Did you really think a fake name and a new life would be enough to keep you from me? Cale continued, his voice getting closer to the cabin with each word, and she could picture him in her mind's eye, still handsome, still impeccably dressed, still radiating the kind of confidence that came from never being told no about anything that mattered to him. I've been watching you for weeks, learning your little routines, your pathetic attempts at happiness. You've been playing house up here like a child with her dolls, but playtime is over now. It's time to come home where you belong. His laughter was the sound of breaking glass and burning bridges, carrying echoes of every cruel joke and humiliating comment he had ever made at her expense, every time he had convinced her that she was worthless and deserving of whatever punishment he decided to inflict. When she heard his footsteps approaching the front porch with deliberate slowness, savoring each moment of her growing terror, Seraphina felt every defense mechanism she had built over 5 years crumble into dust. This was it. This was how her story ended, cowering in a cabin while the man who had destroyed her once came back to finish what he had started, to claim the victory that had been denied to him for far too long. But then Dante stepped in front of her, and something happened to him that made her gasp and stumble backward in shock and terror and impossible fascination. The change began in his eyes. Those beautiful golden orbs that had captivated her from the moment she first saw them, blazing with a fire that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight, burning with an inner flame that seemed to come from some primal source deep within his soul. The pupils elongated into something distinctly non-human, and the irises began to swirl with patterns of light that reminded her of molten metal cooling into ancient symbols she couldn't read but somehow understood on a level deeper than conscious thought. His hands shifted next, fingers extending into something that looked more like claws than human appendages, each digit ending in a razor-sharp point that could probably shred steel as easily as paper. The transformation was both gradual and swift, as if his human form was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion that was finally being allowed to drop away and reveal the truth that had been hiding beneath. When he smiled, she caught a glimpse of teeth that were definitely not meant for a normal human mouth. Canines that had elongated into fangs designed for tearing flesh, premolars that looked like they could crush bones without effort. "Stay behind me," he growled, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in frequencies only predators could hear, sounds that bypassed her rational mind and spoke directly to instincts that were older than civilization itself. "And whatever happens, whatever you see, don't run. I promise you, Seraphina, he will never hurt you again." The words came out layered with overtones that made her bones vibrate in sympathy, as if his voice alone was enough to reshape reality around them. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, and as she stared at this beautiful, impossible creature who had appeared in her life just when she needed saving most, only one thought echoed through her terrified mind: Dante wasn't human, and somehow, that was exactly what she needed him to be. But then something extraordinary began to happen to Seraphina herself. Something that defied every law of nature she thought she understood. As Dante's golden eyes blazed with inhuman fire, she felt an answering call deep within her own blood, a sensation like electricity racing through her veins and pooling in her chest where her heart hammered against her ribs with increasing intensity. The feeling was alien and familiar at the same time, as if some long-dormant part of herself was finally waking up after years of enforced slumber. Her grandmother's silver locket, hanging from its chain around her neck, began to grow warm against her skin, then hot, then almost burning with a heat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her accelerated heartbeat. The warmth spread outward from the locket like ripples in a pond, flowing through her body with a tingling sensation that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She could feel something fundamental shifting inside her, awakening responses that she had no name for but that felt as natural as breathing. When she looked down at her hands, they were beginning to glow with a soft silver light that seemed to emanate from within her very cells, as if her blood had been replaced with liquid moonlight. The light was beautiful and otherworldly, casting everything around her in shades of pearl and platinum that made the ordinary cabin look like something from a fairy tale. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, but even as the words left her lips, fragments of her grandmother's stories began to make terrible, wonderful sense. The tales of women in their family who had been blessed by the moon itself, who could speak to wild creatures and heal wounds with their touch, who were sought after by supernatural beings because of the power that flowed in their veins like rivers of starlight. Grandmother Elena's insistence that their bloodline was special, that they carried within them the legacy of something ancient and powerful that most of the world had forgotten existed. The silver light in her eyes intensified as buried memories surfaced with painful clarity. Grandmother Elena teaching her to read the phases of the moon, whispering that their family had once served as bridges between the human world and something far older and wilder. The way animals had always been drawn to her, the vivid dreams that had plagued her childhood, filled with images of running through moonlit forests alongside creatures that were neither fully human nor fully beast. The inexplicable sense of longing she had always felt during full moons, as if some essential part of herself was missing and could only be found under the light of Luna's silver face. As the transformation continued, Seraphina could feel her senses expanding in ways that should have been impossible. She could suddenly hear Cale's heartbeat through the cabin walls, could smell the cologne he still wore and the underlying scent of something darker, something predatory and wrong that made her newly awakened instincts scream warnings about danger and deception. But more than that, she could sense Dante's true nature with a clarity that took her breath away, could feel the wild power that coursed through him like a raging river barely contained by his human form. He was an alpha. She knew that now with the certainty of someone who had finally found the missing piece of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was trying to solve. More than that, she could feel the bond that stretched between them like a silver cord connecting their souls, a connection that had been forged the moment their eyes first met during the storm but had remained dormant until this moment of crisis and revelation. It wasn't just attraction or affection, it was something far deeper and more primal, something that spoke of destinies intertwined and fates that had been written in the stars long before either of them had been born. The realization hit her with the force of revelation. She wasn't just a random human who had caught an alpha's attention. She was Lunaborn, a daughter of the moon goddess's chosen lineage, and Dante had been unconsciously drawn to her across impossible distances because their souls recognized each other as perfect matches. The stories her grandmother had whispered weren't fairy tales at all, they were the suppressed history of her own family, the truth about what she really was and why she had always felt like she was living in the wrong world. As her silver eyes met Dante's golden gaze across the small space of her cabin, she saw recognition flare in his transformed features, saw the moment when he realized what she was becoming and what it meant for both of them. The air between them crackled with power and possibility, with the promise of a connection that went beyond anything either of them had ever imagined possible. For the first time in her life, Seraphina felt complete, felt like she was finally becoming who she was always meant to be. But outside, Cale's voice was getting closer, and she could hear the confidence in his tone that spoke of someone who had no idea what kind of forces he was about to face. Come out, wherever you are," he called with mock playfulness that couldn't hide the underlying menace. "I've got all day, and I'm very much looking forward to our reunion. We have so much catching up to do, so many things to discuss about your little vacation from reality." The Luna power flowing through Seraphina's veins pulsed stronger as her anger mounted, silver fire dancing behind her eyes as she thought about all the years of pain and fear this man had caused her, all the nights she had spent wondering if she would ever truly be free of his shadow. But now, standing beside an alpha werewolf with her own supernatural heritage finally awakened, she realized that Cale Morrison was about to discover what it meant to threaten something truly precious to beings far more dangerous than he could ever hope to become. Chapter 3, The Alpha Revealed. Cale Morrison kicked in Seraphina's front door with the casual violence of a man who had never been told no in his entire privileged life, and the sight of him after 5 years hit her like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He looked exactly the same, perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive suit despite being in the middle of nowhere, and those cold green eyes that had once made her feel special but now reminded her of chips of ice floating in poison. But there was something different about him too, something harder and more dangerous, as if the years of searching for her had refined his cruelty into something sharp enough to cut souls. "There's my beautiful wife," he said with that familiar smile that had never quite reached his eyes, the same smile he had worn while breaking her ribs and her spirit piece by piece. "She's not your wife," Dante said quietly, stepping forward to place himself between them, and Seraphina watched in fascination and terror as power seemed to roll off him in waves that made the air itself feel electric. "And she's not going anywhere with you." Cale's gaze shifted to this unexpected obstacle, and she saw the moment when he sized up Dante's impressive frame and dismissed him as just another problem that money and violence could solve. It was a mistake that might have been funny if her entire life hadn't been hanging in the balance, because whatever Cale thought he was looking at, he had no idea what Dante really was or what he was capable of when something he cared about was threatened. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Cale asked with the kind of condescending amusement that had always preceded his worst rages, pulling back his jacket to reveal the gun holstered at his side. "Some mountain man hero here to save the day? Let me explain something to you, friend, that woman belongs to me. She's been mine for 7 years, and a piece of paper doesn't change that. Now step aside, or this is going to get unpleasant for everyone involved." He spoke with the absolute confidence of someone who had never encountered a predator higher up the food chain than himself, someone who had spent his entire life using fear and violence to get what he wanted without ever meeting anything that could fight back. That's when Dante laughed, and the sound made every primitive instinct Seraphina possessed scream warnings about apex predators and ancient dangers that modern humans had forgotten how to recognize. Unpleasant, he repeated, as if the word amused him beyond measure, and when he took a step toward Kale, something fundamental shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. You have no idea what unpleasant looks like. His eyes blazed with that impossible golden fire, his fingers extended into claws that could shred steel, and when he smiled, his teeth were definitely not human anymore. But you're about to learn. The transformation was swift and terrible and beautiful all at once. One moment Dante was a man, and the next he was something that made wolves look like house pets, something that belonged in legends and nightmares rather than her small mountain cabin. Kale's gun was in his hand and firing before his conscious mind had fully processed what he was seeing, but Dante moved like liquid lightning, closing the distance between them in a single fluid motion that ended with Kale pinned against the wall by claws that pressed against his throat like promises of death. She is under my protection now, Dante growled in a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself. And if you ever, come near her again, I will show you exactly what happens to men who hurt what belongs to me. The golden eyes found hers across the room, and in them she saw not just the wild creature he had become, but the man who had made her breakfast and listened to her stories and looked at her like she was something worth protecting rather than something to be owned. Seraphina pressed her back against the cabin wall, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, as she watched the impossible scene unfolding before her eyes. Dante, or whatever Dante really was, held Kale suspended 3 feet off the ground with one clawed hand wrapped around his throat, and the casual display of inhuman strength made her legs weak with a mixture of terror and something else she couldn't quite name. This was what had been hiding beneath that perfect exterior, this wild and dangerous creature that moved with predatory grace and burned with golden fire that seemed to come from another world entirely. The silver light still pulsed through her own veins from her awakening in the previous moments, making her newly enhanced senses pick up details she never could have noticed before, the way Dante's muscles coiled with barely restrained power, the subtle shift in his bone structure that spoke of something far removed from human limitations, the ancient wildness that radiated from him like heat from a forge. But even as every logical part of her mind screamed that she should be running as far and as fast as her legs could carry her, another deeper part of her, the Lunaborn part that had finally awakened to its true nature, recognized something that made her stay frozen in place with fascination rather than fear. He was protecting her. This beautiful, terrifying creature had stepped between her and the nightmare that had haunted her for 5 years, had transformed into something from legends and myths because she was worth defending. The bond she could feel stretching between them like a silver cord pulsed with his determination, his absolute certainty that no harm would come to her while he drew breath, and that knowledge filled her with a strength she had never known she possessed. What are you? Kale gasped, his face turning purple as those impossibly strong fingers tightened around his windpipe with the precise pressure of someone who knew exactly how much force was required to cause maximum discomfort without allowing the mercy of unconsciousness. For the first time since she had known him, Seraphina heard genuine fear in his voice instead of that cold, controlled cruelty that had dominated her life for so many years, and the sound was sweeter than any music she had ever heard. The man who had spent years convincing her that she was powerless, that she was nothing without him, was finally face to face with something that made him feel as small and helpless as he had made her feel every single day of their relationship. Dante's smile was all sharp teeth and ancient promises of violence, the kind of expression that belonged on creatures who hunted under blood moons and answered to no human authority whatsoever. His golden eyes burned with an inner fire that seemed to come from the very core of the earth itself, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something far older and more primal than civilization. I'm exactly what your kind should have learned to fear a long time ago, he growled, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into her bones, making the cabin itself seem to pulse with his power. I'm an alpha. The word hit Seraphina like lightning, unlocking not just memories of childhood stories her grandmother had whispered about creatures that walked the line between man and beast, but also deeper recognition from her newly awakened Luna heritage. These weren't just tales told to frighten children, they were the hidden history of a world that existed parallel to human society, a world where beings of incredible power and wildness moved through the shadows and commanded forces that modern science couldn't begin to explain. Werewolves. The knowledge should have sent her screaming into the forest, should have shattered her mind with the impossibility of it all, but instead she found herself studying Dante's transformed features with a fascination that bordered on hunger. This explained everything that had puzzled her about him. The way he moved like liquid shadow given form, the inhuman grace that made even simple gestures look like choreographed poetry, the eyes that seemed to see straight through her soul and into the very essence of who she was beneath all her carefully constructed defenses. The scent of wild places and dangerous things that clung to him like the most expensive perfume, the way he had known exactly where to look when scanning for threats, the military precision with which he had assessed her cabin's defensive capabilities. He was a creature from legends, a being of such power that he could have taken anything he wanted from the world, and he had chosen to protect her. But her newfound Luna senses were picking up something else now, something that made the silver light in her veins pulse with warning signals she was only beginning to understand. There was another supernatural presence in the cabin, one that felt completely different from Dante's wild, natural power. Where the Alpha's energy felt like forest fires and mountain streams, clean and fierce and alive, this other presence was cold and ancient in a way that made her skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. It took her a moment to realize that the wrongness she was sensing was coming from Kale himself. An alpha vampire can't exist, Kale wheezed, his expensive suit wrinkled and torn from the brief struggle, but there was something in his tone that made Seraphina's blood freeze despite the supernatural fire flowing through her veins. The way he said vampire wasn't the confused guess of a terrified human trying to make sense of the impossible, it was the casual observation of someone who understood exactly what they were talking about. Seraphina saw confusion flicker across Dante's transformed features for just a moment before his expression hardened into something that could have cut diamond, and she realized that Kale's words had revealed far more than he had intended. Vampire? Dante repeated, his voice dropping to a register that made the cabin's windows rattle in their frames and sent vibrations through the floor that she could feel in her bones. Is that what you think I am? The laughter that escaped him was dark and rich and filled with the kind of amusement that preceded terrible violence, but underneath the mockery, Seraphina could hear genuine confusion about why Kale would make such a specific assumption. No, little human. I'm something far older, far more dangerous than your vampire fairy tales. I'm a werewolf. He repeated, his voice changing as he spoke, taking on harmonics that were hauntingly beautiful and absolutely terrifying. Oh, my sweet, naive wolf. You have no idea what you're dealing with, do you? The transformation that came over Kale was subtle but unmistakable to her enhanced Luna senses. His skin took on a pale, marble-like quality that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and when he smiled, she caught a glimpse of fangs that were nothing like Dante's canine teeth. These were the needle-sharp instruments of a creature designed for a very different kind of feeding. His eyes, which had always been cold green, now held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades, and the casual way he hung in Dante's grip suggested that the Alpha's strength, while impressive, was not quite the overwhelming force it had first appeared to be. You want to know what I really am, wolf? Kale continued, his voice now carrying the hypnotic cadence that Seraphina suddenly realized had been woven through every conversation they had ever had, every argument, every moment of supposed intimacy during their relationship. I'm something your kind has been trying to hunt to extinction for over 1,000 years. I'm a vampire, and not just any vampire. I'm old enough to remember when your ancestors still howled at the moon from caves and thought fire was the pinnacle of technology. The words hit Seraphina like physical blows, each revelation recontextualizing years of memories and making her see their entire relationship in a horrifying new light. The way he had always seemed to know exactly what she was thinking, the strange gaps in her memory from their time together, the way she had felt drained and exhausted after spending time with him even when they hadn't been fighting. The nightmares that had plagued her for years, dreams so vivid that she would wake up convinced they were real, dreams where Kale found her and dragged her back into hell while she screamed for help that never came. You see, my dear Seraphina, Kale continued, his gaze shifting to her with an intimacy that made her want to scrub her skin raw, our relationship was never quite what you thought it was. Oh, the emotions were real enough, your fear, your desperation, your gradual breakdown as I systematically destroyed every aspect of your self-worth. Those were absolutely genuine, and they were absolutely delicious. But you were never really in control of your own mind, were you? You always wondered why you stayed so long, why you kept making excuses for me even when the evidence of what I was doing became impossible to ignore. The silver light in Seraphina's veins pulsed brighter as rage and horror flooded through her system in equal measure. Her Luna heritage was allowing her to see the truth of what he was describing, to recognize the psychic fingerprints he had left all over her memories like a spider's web designed to catch and hold its prey. Every moment of self-doubt, every time she had questioned her own perceptions or blamed herself for his violence, every instance where she had felt like she was losing her mind, it had all been his influence, his vampiric power worming its way through her thoughts and reshaping her reality to suit his needs. The mind control was subtle, of course. Cale continued with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather rather than describing years of psychological torture. Nothing so crude as outright domination. That would have been boring, and it would have broken you too quickly. No, I preferred a lighter touch. Just enough influence to keep you confused, to make you doubt your own instincts, to ensure that you would never quite find the strength to leave me permanently. It was an art form, really, the way I could make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself while keeping you just functional enough to provide the kind of sustained emotional feeding that only a truly terrified human can offer. Dante's growl filled the cabin with such menace that dust began to fall from the rafters, but Cale seemed utterly unconcerned by the alpha's fury. You're wondering how I found her after all these years, aren't you, Wolf? How I managed to track her to this pathetic little hiding place in the middle of nowhere? The answer is beautifully simple. I never lost her. The psychic link I embedded in her mind during our years together has been active this entire time, feeding me a steady stream of her emotional energy while providing me with a connection that transcends any physical distance. The revelation hit Seraphina like a sledgehammer to the chest, stealing her breath and making her legs give out beneath her. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, staring at Cale with growing horror as the full scope of what he was describing began to sink in. She had never escaped him. Not really. For 5 years, she had been living in the illusion of freedom while he fed off her fear and loneliness like a parasite, growing stronger on her suffering while she congratulated herself on surviving his abuse. Every nightmare you've had about me has been real, sweetheart, Cale said with mock gentleness that made her want to vomit. Every dream where I found you, every vision of me dragging you back into hell, those were actual visits. Little excursions into your sleeping mind where I could remind you what you were running from and ensure that the fear never quite faded enough for you to find genuine peace. Did you really think your unconscious mind was creative enough to dream up such vivid, detailed scenarios of psychological torture? No, my dear. Those were all me, keeping our connection alive and ensuring that you would never stop providing me with the kind of exquisite terror that makes centuries of existence worthwhile. The silver light coursing through Seraphina's body flared brighter as her Luna heritage responded to the depth of violation she was finally understanding. The psychic rape that had been ongoing for years, the way her very mind had been invaded and manipulated without her knowledge or consent, the realization that her escape had been nothing more than an elaborate game designed to heighten her eventual recapture, it was almost too much for her consciousness to process. But underneath the horror and rage, something else was building. Something that felt like moonlight and starfire and the ancient power of women who refused to be victims. The only reason you managed to get away 5 years ago, Cale continued with obvious relish for her growing distress, was because I was in the middle of hunting something particularly challenging, a family of psychic humans who had managed to shield themselves from vampiric detection for 3 generations. Maintaining the level of control I needed to keep you compliant while simultaneously tracking my primary prey required more concentration than I was willing to sustain indefinitely. So I let my grip on your mind slip just enough for you to find the courage to run, knowing that I could always retrieve you later when the hunt was complete and I had time to properly savor your recapture. Dante's fury was reaching levels that made the very air around him shimmer with heat, but Seraphina could see through their mate bond that he was struggling with the implications of what Cale was revealing. How did you fight an enemy who had been psychically connected to your mate for years? How did you protect someone from a predator who had already infiltrated the most intimate spaces of their mind? The tactical problem was unlike anything an alpha werewolf would normally face, and she could feel his frustration building as he tried to calculate strategies for a battle that had been ongoing for half a decade without him even knowing it existed. But then something unexpected happened, Cale said, his pale eyes focusing on Dante with newfound interest. My little pet started broadcasting some very unusual emotional signatures through our connection. Fear was still there, of course, that never goes away completely, but there was something else. Excitement. Attraction. The kind of deep, primal recognition that speaks of supernatural mating bonds. That's when I realized that my toy had managed to catch the attention of something far more interesting than a simple human predator. The word mate hit Seraphina like a physical blow, sending heat flooding through her system in ways that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the primal recognition that sang in her blood when she looked at this beautiful, deadly creature who had appeared in her life like a gift from the moon goddess herself. Dante's golden eyes found hers across the room, and in them she saw not just the wild beast he had become, but something deeper, a claiming, a choosing, a promise that she would never have to face the darkness alone again. The Luna power flowing through her veins responded to his alpha energy like a tuning fork finding its perfect pitch, creating harmonics of power that made the cabin's walls vibrate with supernatural resonance. A werewolf alpha and a Luna-born human, Cale mused with the tone of someone contemplating a particularly interesting puzzle. I must admit, I didn't see that coming. The bloodline awakening explains why my control over her has been weakening recently. Luna heritage creates natural shields against vampiric influence once it's properly activated. But it also makes her infinitely more valuable than I originally realized. Do you have any idea what a Luna-born female is worth on the supernatural black market, Wolf? What certain ancient vampires would pay for the chance to drain that kind of power directly from the source? Cale's struggles were growing weaker as oxygen deprivation took its toll, but Seraphina found she couldn't bring herself to feel sorry for him anymore. The revelation of what he truly was, what he had been doing to her all these years, had burned away every trace of the Stockholm Syndrome that had once made her question whether she deserved better treatment. After 5 years of nightmares and constant fear, after 5 years of looking over her shoulder and jumping at shadows that turned out to be all too real, watching him finally meet something more dangerous than himself felt like justice wrapped in claws and golden fire. But as she stared at this monster wearing the face of the man who had destroyed her life piece by piece, Seraphina felt something new stirring in her chest, not just the Luna power that connected her to Dante, but her own strength, her own fury, her own determination to never again be anyone's victim or prey. The silver light in her eyes blazed brighter as she slowly stood up, drawing on reserves of courage she had never known she possessed. You made one mistake, Cale, she said quietly, her voice carrying harmonics of power that made both supernatural males turn to stare at her in surprise. You assumed that I would always be the same broken girl you spent years tearing down. But I'm not human anymore, and I'm not yours. I'm Luna-born, I'm claimed by an alpha who actually knows what loyalty means, and I'm done being afraid of you. The psychic connection that had tormented her for so long was still there, but now she could feel it clearly, could see the threads of vampiric influence that had been woven through her mind like a spider's web designed to catch and hold its prey. But her Luna heritage was stronger than Cale had anticipated, and with Dante's alpha energy supporting her through their mate bond, she found she could do something she had never imagined possible. She could fight back. Chapter 4, The Choice of Forever. Let him go, Seraphina said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk, and both men turned to look at her with expressions of shock and confusion that would have been comical under different circumstances. But she wasn't speaking out of mercy for Cale, she was speaking from a place of strength she had forgotten she possessed, a core of steel that 5 years of hiding had buried but not destroyed completely. The Luna power flowing through her veins sang with newfound confidence, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she was standing in her own skin rather than cowering in the shadow of someone else's expectations. The silver light in her eyes pulsed with determination as she met Dante's burning golden gaze without flinching, drawing on reserves of courage that her supernatural heritage had finally unlocked. He's not worth it, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word as the truth of what she was saying resonated through every fiber of her being. And I want him to live with the knowledge that he lost. That he couldn't break me. That someone else was strong enough to protect what he could never deserve. Her words rang with power and conviction that seemed to make the very air around them shimmer with potential energy, and she saw something shift in Dante's expression, pride, respect, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken with anticipation of possibilities she was only beginning to understand. The mate bond between them thrummed with approval and admiration, carrying his emotions to her as clearly as if he had spoken them aloud. The transformation in herself was as profound as anything that had happened to Dante during his shift into alpha form. For years, she had defined herself by what Kale had done to her, had allowed his cruelty to shape her understanding of her own worth and capabilities. But now, with her Luna heritage awakened and an alpha's strength supporting her through their supernatural connection, she could see herself clearly for the first time, not as a victim to be pitted or a prize to be won, but as a woman with her own power, her own choices, her own ability to determine the course of her life. The realization was intoxicating, filling her with a sense of possibility that made her want to laugh and cry and roar with triumph all at the same time. Dante released Kale with a casual gesture that sent the smaller man crashing to the floor in a heap of expensive fabric and wounded pride, gasping for air and clutching at his bruised throat with hands that shook from more than just oxygen deprivation. The vampire's pale skin had taken on a grayish tinge that spoke of genuine fear, and his cold green eyes held a wildness that suggested his legendary composure was finally beginning to crack under the weight of encountering forces beyond his ability to manipulate or control. "You heard her," the Alpha said, his voice still carrying that inhuman resonance that made the cabin's foundation seem to vibrate in sympathetic response to his power. "Walk away. Run back to whatever hole you crawled out of, and pray that our paths never cross again. Because next time, I won't be so merciful." The promise in those words was absolute and terrifying, carrying the weight of ancient authority that predated human civilization by millennia. Kale scrambled to his feet with none of his usual grace, his expensive suit torn and disheveled in ways that would have horrified his image-conscious nature under normal circumstances, but these were far from normal circumstances. His face was a mask of rage and humiliation that made his features look almost demonic in the flickering light from the fireplace, but when he looked at Dante's transformed features, still partially shifted, still carrying traces of the beast that lurked just beneath the surface, whatever threats he might have made died unspoken in his throat. Even someone as arrogant and cruel as Kale Morrison, even a vampire with centuries of experience in predation and violence, knew better than to challenge a werewolf alpha that could tear him apart without breaking a sweat. "This isn't over," Kale snarled as he backed toward the ruined door, his green eyes promising future violence and revenge with the kind of cold certainty that had once made Seraphina curl up in closets and pray to become invisible. But his voice lacked its usual conviction, carrying undertones of uncertainty that suggested he was beginning to understand that the rules of the game had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. "She's mine, and I'll find a way to take her back. I always do." The words were spoken more to convince himself than to threaten them, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of control in a situation that had spiraled far beyond his ability to manipulate. But even as he spoke the words, Seraphina could see the defeat in his posture, the knowledge that he had finally met something beyond his ability to control or destroy written in every line of his retreating form. The psychic connection between them was still there, she could feel it like a thin strand of ice threading through her consciousness, but her Luna heritage had built walls around her mind that his vampiric influence could no longer penetrate. For the first time in over 7 years, her thoughts were entirely her own, and the freedom of that realization was almost overwhelming in its intensity. Dante's soft laughter followed Kale into the forest like a promise of nightmares, rich with dark amusement that spoke of predators who understood exactly what kind of mercy they were showing and how easily it could be withdrawn. When the sound of the vampire's panicked retreat finally faded into silence, broken only by the distant crash of branches and the fading echo of footsteps moving far too quickly for human locomotion, the cabin felt different. Not just safer, but somehow blessed by the presence of something ancient and protective that had chosen to make it stand here. The very air seemed to pulse with residual energy from their confrontation, charged with the kind of power that came from supernatural forces clashing and finding their proper balance. As the immediate danger passed and the adrenaline began to fade from her system, Seraphina watched in fascination as Dante slowly shifted back into his human form. The process was as mesmerizing as his initial transformation had been terrifying, a gradual return to humanity that somehow managed to retain traces of the wildness that made him so compelling. The claws retracted with fluid grace, the golden fire in his eyes dimmed to a warm amber glow that somehow felt more intimate than any physical touch, and the predatory tension that had coiled through his muscles relaxed into something that was still dangerous but no longer immediately threatening. He was still the most beautiful man she had ever seen, but now she knew what lay beneath that perfect exterior, not just the beast that could tear apart her enemies without hesitation, but the alpha who had looked at her broken life and decided she was worth protecting regardless of the cost to himself. The knowledge changed everything about how she saw him, adding layers of depth and meaning to every gesture, every glance, every moment they had shared since that storm had brought him to her door like a dark angel seeking sanctuary. "I should have told you," Dante said quietly, vulnerability replacing the predatory confidence that had faced down Kale with such devastating effectiveness. His voice carried undertones of guilt and uncertainty that made her heart ache with the desire to comfort him, to show him that his secrets hadn't diminished her feelings but had actually deepened them in ways she was still trying to understand. "About what I am. About why I was really here." His hands shook slightly as he ran them through his dark hair, and she realized that this powerful, dangerous creature was genuinely afraid that she would reject him now that she knew the truth about his supernatural nature. The vulnerability in his confession did something profound to her chest, loosening knots of fear and uncertainty that she hadn't even realized were still there after everything they had been through together. Here was a being of immense power and ancient authority, someone who could command forces that most humans couldn't even imagine, and he was worried that she might not accept him. The irony would have been amusing if it hadn't been so deeply touching, and she found herself falling even deeper in love with this complicated, dangerous, wonderful man who had appeared in her life exactly when she needed him most. But as she looked into his amber eyes, still glowing faintly with residual supernatural energy, Seraphina could see that there was more he wasn't telling her. The guilt in his expression went deeper than simple worry about her reaction to his werewolf nature, and her newly awakened Luna senses were picking up emotional undercurrents that spoke of secrets far more complex than anything he had revealed so far. Whatever had brought him to these mountains, whatever had led him to her door during that storm, she was beginning to suspect that it hadn't been the simple coincidence she had originally assumed. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked gently, placing her hands on his chest and feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms like a wild bird trying to escape its cage. The mate bond between them carried his emotions as clearly as spoken words, and what she sensed there made her breath catch in her throat with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Dante, whatever it is, you can tell me. After everything we've just been through, after everything I've learned about myself and about you, I think I can handle whatever truth you're still carrying." Instead of answering immediately, Dante pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair as if he could hide from the weight of his confession in the familiar scent of her skin. When he finally spoke, his voice was muffled but clear enough for her enhanced hearing to catch every word, every nuance of pain and regret that colored his admission. "My appearance during the storm wasn't coincidence, Seraphina. I wasn't just a traveler seeking shelter, and I wasn't wandering these mountains for my own reasons. I was sent here by the Werewolf High Council to find you." The words hit her like physical blows, each revelation striking her with enough force to make her stagger backward if his arms hadn't been holding her steady. The High Council, even with her limited knowledge of supernatural politics, she understood that this was the governing body for all werewolves, the ancient authority that had maintained order among the packs for thousands of years. The fact that they had sent someone specifically to find her suggested implications that made her mind reel with possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. "To find me," she repeated, her voice coming out smaller than she intended as the full scope of what he was telling her began to sink in. "But why would the High Council even know I existed? Until yesterday, I didn't even know I was Lunaborn. How could they possibly have been tracking someone who didn't know what she was?" But even as she asked the questions, fragments of her grandmother's stories began clicking into place in her mind, tales of women and their family who had been sought after by powerful supernatural beings, who had been forced to hide their true nature to avoid becoming pawns in conflicts they didn't understand. Dante's grip tightened around her, as if he could anchor her to him through sheer physical contact, while his words threatened to tear apart everything she thought she understood about their relationship. Luna bloodlines are incredibly rare, and they're all monitored by the supernatural community from the moment they're born. Your grandmother was on our lists, and so was your mother, and so were you. The council has been watching your family for generations, waiting to see if the dormant genes would ever activate. When your mother died without awakening her heritage, they thought the bloodline had finally died out. But then certain indicators began suggesting that you might still carry the potential. The revelation that her entire family had been under supernatural surveillance for generations made her feel violated in ways that went beyond anything Kale had done to her mind. The idea that her most private moments, her most personal struggles, had been observed and catalogued by beings she had never known existed was almost too much to process. But worse than the invasion of privacy was the growing certainty that Dante's presence in her life hadn't been the beautiful accident she had believed it to be, but rather the culmination of a plan that had been set in motion long before she had ever laid eyes on his perfect face. "What were your orders?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the guilt and anguish radiating through their mate bond. The Luna power in her veins was singing with warning signals now, showing her glimpses of truth that her conscious mind didn't want to accept. "When the council sent you to find me, what were you supposed to do?" Her voice was steady despite the chaos of emotions roiling through her chest, but she could feel cracks forming in the foundation of everything she had come to believe about their connection. Dante was silent for so long that she began to wonder if he was going to answer at all, but when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, thick with self-loathing that made her heart ache even as her mind reeled from his confession. "I was sent to confirm your Luna heritage and assess the level of threat you represented to supernatural stability. An awakened Luna can influence and control all supernatural beings, not just werewolves. Vampires, witches, fae, even dragons if any still existed. None of us are immune to Luna command once the bloodline reaches full power. The council considers that kind of ability to be an unacceptable risk to the existing order." The implications of what he was telling her crashed over her like a tidal wave, sweeping away her naive assumptions about supernatural politics and her place in a world she was only beginning to understand. She wasn't just a woman with unusual heritage, she was a weapon, a force of nature that could potentially reshape the entire supernatural landscape if she ever learned to properly wield her abilities. The knowledge was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, filling her with a sense of responsibility she had never asked for and power she had never imagined possessing. "And if you confirmed that I was a threat?" she asked, though the mate bond was already carrying his answer to her in waves of anguish that made her chest tight with sympathetic pain. "What were your orders then, Dante? What was the council's solution to the Luna problem?" But she already knew, could see the truth written in the defeated slump of his shoulders and the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes when she pulled back to look at his face. "Elimination," he said simply, the word falling between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of consequence that would change everything they had built together. "I was ordered to execute you before your powers could fully awaken, before you could become a threat to the supernatural world order that the council has spent millennia maintaining. It was supposed to be quick and clean. Find the Luna heir, confirm the bloodline activation, and eliminate the threat before it could destabilize everything." The confession hung in the air between them like a poison cloud, contaminating every sweet memory they had created together and casting shadows over every moment of tenderness they had shared. Seraphina felt something cold and hard settle in her chest as the full scope of his betrayal became clear, not just the deception about his identity but the ultimate purpose behind every smile, every gentle touch, every word of comfort he had offered. He had come to kill her, had been ordered to end her life, and everything else, the protection, the claimed mate bond, even the love she had thought was growing between them, had been nothing more than complications to his original mission. "But you didn't," she said quietly, her voice carrying a strange mixture of hurt and hope that reflected the war being fought in her heart between betrayal and understanding. You're telling me this, which means you didn't complete your mission. Why? What changed your mind? The questions came out steadier than she felt, but underneath her apparent calm, she was drowning in a sea of conflicting emotions that threatened to tear her apart from the inside out. Dante's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating, carrying none of the warmth she had grown to love during their brief time together. I fell in love with you, he said simply, as if those 5 words could explain away the magnitude of what he had revealed, as if love could somehow erase the fact that he had been sent to murder her in cold blood. From the moment I saw you in that storm, soaked to the skin and terrified but still brave enough to let a stranger into your home, I knew that I could never complete the mission I had been given. The mate bond snapped into place before I even understood what was happening, and suddenly killing you became not just impossible but unthinkable. The raw honesty in his confession did something complicated to her heart, creating fractures in her anger that allowed other emotions to seep through: understanding, sympathy, and yes, despite everything, love. Because she could feel through their bond that every word he spoke was absolutely true, could sense the genuine anguish he felt over the deception and the very real love that had grown from what should have been a simple assassination mission. He had chosen her over his duty, had chosen love over loyalty to his entire species, and that choice had cost him everything he had ever known. The Marcus Silvermoon threat, she said suddenly, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place in her mind as understanding dawned with horrible clarity. That message we received, it's not about territory at all, is it? The Council sent another Alpha to finish what you couldn't do. They're coming to kill me, and anyone who stands in their way. The knowledge settled over her like a shroud, heavy with the weight of consequences she had never chosen but would have to face nonetheless. Dante nodded grimly, his arms tightening around her as if he could protect her from the truth through sheer physical contact. Marcus Silvermoon is the Council's most efficient executor, and he's been given permission to eliminate any obstacles to his mission, including me. Every moment we're together, every second I choose to protect you instead of completing my original orders, I'm committing treason against my own kind. The penalty for that level of betrayal is death, not just for me but for anyone who aids me. The scope of what he was sacrificing for her was staggering, almost impossible to comprehend. He wasn't just risking his own life, he was turning his back on his entire species, abandoning everything he had ever known or believed in for the sake of a woman he had known for less than 24 hours. The gesture was simultaneously the most romantic and most terrifying thing anyone had ever done for her, and she found herself struggling to process the magnitude of what it meant for both of their futures. You should have told me sooner, Seraphina said finally, her voice carrying a complex mixture of hurt and understanding that reflected the chaos of emotions churning through her system. I should have had the right to make my own choices about the risks we were taking, about what I was willing to sacrifice for this connection between us. But even as she spoke the words of recrimination, she could feel her resolve weakening under the weight of his obvious remorse and the very real love flowing between them through their supernatural bond. You're right, Dante agreed without hesitation, his voice thick with guilt and self-recrimination that made her want to comfort him even as she struggled with her own sense of betrayal. I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning, should have given you the chance to understand what you were getting involved in before the Council's deadline ran out. I was a coward, and my cowardice may have cost us both everything we could have had together. But as Seraphina looked into his amber eyes, still glowing faintly with residual supernatural energy, she realized that despite everything, despite the deception, despite the original intent to kill her, despite the impossible odds they now faced together, her feelings for him hadn't changed. If anything, learning the truth about the sacrifices he had made for her sake had only deepened her love for this complicated, dangerous, wonderful man who had chosen her over everything else in his world. What happens now? She asked quietly, placing her hands on his chest and feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms like a drum calling warriors to battle. The Council won't just give up because you've had a change of heart. They'll keep sending alphas until one of them completes the mission, won't they? The future stretched out before them like a minefield, filled with dangers she was only beginning to understand and choices that would determine not just their own fates but potentially the balance of power in the entire supernatural world. Instead of answering immediately, Dante pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair as if he could find sanctuary in the familiar scent of her skin. When he finally spoke, his voice was muffled but determined, carrying undertones of resolve that made her pulse quicken with anticipation of possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. "Now we fight," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of ancient authority and modern determination. "We fight for our right to choose our own destiny, for our right to love each other despite what the Council thinks about Luna bloodlines and supernatural stability. And if that makes us traitors to our own kinds, then so be it." The declaration sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the recognition that she had finally found someone worth fighting for, someone worth risking everything to keep. As Dante's arms closed around her with fierce protectiveness, pulling her against his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his warrior's heart, Seraphina finally understood what it meant to be claimed by an alpha who would choose love over loyalty, who would choose her over everything else in his world, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choice for him, consequences be damned. 3 months later, Seraphina stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dante's penthouse apartment, watching the city lights twinkle like earthbound stars 30 stories below. The transition from her isolated mountain cabin to the heart of Seattle had been jarring at first, but learning to live with an alpha werewolf had required adjustments that made geography seem trivial by comparison. Dante's pack had welcomed her with a warmth that still took her breath away. Dozens of supernatural beings who had become the family she had never known she needed, who looked at her not as an outsider or a victim, but as their alpha's chosen mate and therefore worthy of their protection and love. The nightmares about Kale had finally stopped, replaced by dreams of golden eyes and promises that no one would ever hurt her again. "You're thinking too loud," Dante murmured against her neck, his arms sliding around her waist from behind as he joined her at the window, and she melted back against his solid warmth with the automatic trust that still amazed her. His presence filled the elegant space like smoke, making their luxury apartment feel like home in ways her isolated cabin never quite had, because home wasn't a place. It was the steady beat of his heart against her back and the way he made her feel like she was exactly where she belonged. "Just thinking about how different everything is now," she replied, covering his hands with hers and marveling at the way their fingers fit together like puzzle pieces that had been cut from the same stone. The business empire that Dante commanded during his daylight hours had been another revelation, watching this wild creature navigate corporate politics and million-dollar deals with the same predatory intelligence he had used to face down Kale in their mountain cabin. He was ruthless in his professional life but gentle with her in ways that made her heart ache with gratitude for whatever cosmic forces had brought them together during that storm. The pack dynamics had been harder to understand at first, the complex hierarchy, the absolute loyalty, the way they could communicate with looks and subtle gestures that spoke of bonds deeper than blood. But slowly, carefully, they had made space for her in their ancient family structure. But as Seraphina settled deeper into Dante's embrace, watching the human city sprawl endlessly in all directions below them, something moved in the shadows between buildings that made her blood turn to ice. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw eyes looking back at her from the darkness, not green like Kale's, but silver like molten mercury, and filled with an intelligence that was definitely not human. "Dante," she whispered, her voice tight with sudden fear, but when she blinked and looked again, whatever had been watching them was gone, leaving only the ordinary night and the creeping certainty that their troubles were far from over. "What is it?" Dante asked, his entire body going rigid with alertness as his alpha instincts kicked in, and when he followed her gaze to the streets below, she heard him curse softly in a language that sounded older than civilization itself. "The Silvermoon Pack," he growled, his arms tightening around her with protective fury. "They found us." As if summoned by his words, Seraphina's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, and when she read the words displayed on her screen, her knees nearly buckled with terror. "The human girl has made you weak, Dante Blackthorn. Surrender your territory and your pack, or watch everything you love burn. You have 3 days to decide. Marcus Silvermoon, true alpha of the Pacific Northwest." For the first time in months, Seraphina felt truly safe in Dante's arms, but as she stared at those silver eyes watching from the darkness below, she realized their love story was just beginning, and someone very powerful wanted to write its ending in blood and ashes.